there guys, it's Joey, and today we're going to be talking about the Greek god Dionysus. There are two pronunciations. One is Dionysius, and the other one is Dionysus. I'm going to go with Dionysus for now because that's probably what I'm going to automatically say. So just to cover that before we even get anywhere into the video. So this video we're going to talk about some of the themes that came up, the energies when working with this god. It took a little bit of a while working with him. It was interesting. And the themes that I think are really kind of prevalent and important in the world right now when working in a pagan sense with the Greek god Dionysus. At the tail end of the video we will have some products as per request and discuss and show how the energies interwove into them. If you're not interested in that part, of course, so that's at the tail end of the video, so you don't have to watch that if you don't wish to. In the meantime, we will talk about the meat, the juice of the themes, the mythology, and so that will all be up front if that's the only part that you're interested in. So we're going to have a little read about some mythology and then some thoughts and themes on a personal gnosis style connection level. So Dionysus was the god of fertility and wine, and later considered a patron of the arts. He created wine and spread the art of viticulture. He had a dual nature. On one hand he brought joy and divine ecstasy, and on the other he would bring brutal and blinding rage, thus reflecting the dual nature of wine. Dionysus was the son of Zeus and Semele, who was a mortal, and Hera did not take kindly to Zeus putting his dick in everything again. Semele was pregnant and she did not know by which god, Semele. Semele? I think it's Semele actually, Semele. But Hera was not pleased. I think, and she burnt her to a crisp. She was not intact very long, and a gestating Dionysus was picked up by Zeus, stitched into his leg, and birthed this way in one of the the strange ways that Zeus became mother and father when the mortal mother succumbed to punishment of some form by Hera usually. Hera was also jealous of Dionysus and arranged for the Titans to kill him. The Titans ripped him to pieces, however Rhea brought him back to life. After this, Zeus arranged for his protection and gave him to the mountain nymphs to be raised. So he was raised by nymphs, which may kind of explain the idea of his nature. Dionysus was said to have wandered the world, actively spreading his cult. He was accompanied by the Maenads, the wild women flushed with wine, shoulders draped with a fawn skin, carrying rods tipped with pine cones. While other gods had temples to be worshipped at, the followers of Dionysus worshipped him in the woods. There they might go into a state of ecstasy and madness, ripping apart and eating raw any animal they might come upon. Dionysus was one of the few characters able to bring up a dead person back from the underworld. Even though he had never seen Semele, he was concerned for her. Eventually he journeyed into the underworld to find her. He faced down Thanatos, death, and brought her back to Mount Olympus. Dionysus became one of the more important gods in everyday life and was associated with several key concepts. One was rebirth after death. His dismemberment by the Titans and return to life was symbolically echoed in viticulture, where the vines must be pruned back sharply and then become dormant for winter for them to bear fruit the following year. So that's to do with grapes and vines and wine and fruit. Another concept was that under the influence of wine one could be possessed by a great power. Unlike the other gods, Dionysus was not merely a god to be worshipped, but he was also present with his followers at those times. A man could possess supernatural powers and was able to do things he would not be able to do otherwise whilst under the possession and influence of Dionysus, whilst intoxicated, basically. The festival for Dionysus was held in the spring when vines would start bearing leaves. It became one of the most important festivals of the year, and the primary focal point was the theatre. Most of the great Greek plays were initially written to be performed at the feast of Dionysus. All participants, writers, actors, spectators, etc., were regarded as sacred servants of Dionysus during the festival. And this information is available on GreekMythology.com. Okay. So, that is an overview of some of the mythology. And when I was reading and looking around at the energies portrayed with Dionysus, there is kind of this integration. Now, I'm going to say that, the Bacchus is the Roman version. And I'm just going to double check my... Yeah, Bacchus is the Roman god of wine, so he is copied from the Greek Dionysus. He is, again, god in theatre. I'm just checking if they've changed it at all. Bacchus is often confused with Dionysus. They represent the same symbology and myths as Bacchus is the Roman version. I thought so. Yeah. Just double checking my facts and myths, all that good stuff. So on the surface of it, when working with Dionysus, there is a perception of just like drunkenness, of like revelry, of orgies and things like that. And on the surface of spiritual items as well, they're kind of, everything is presented as wine and wine colours and things. And I understand it. But for me, I was like looking at it and it was like a real block. It was like too simplistic. The idea of him just being a god of like drunkenness and wine and things, it was getting in the way of like a deeper understanding of what the energies of Dionysus were actually about for me, and connecting with that energy and conduiting that energy through myself to try and figure out why that was so simplistic. And I realised what was actually going on was it was kind of, because it was limited and it was a limitation on the energies of Dionysus, it was not presenting him in his entirety. It was like one tiny chink of something that was much vaster, much broader, much greater, and much deeper in connecting with those particular energies. And when working with him and creating energies to be in temple with him, and temple in the wandering sense, because he's much more woodland based, and then wandering cult sense rather than physical temple sense. I had to make sure I made that point appropriately, apparently. And breathe. There was something beyond it, and I was thinking about Dionysus in like modern times and what he would represent now, and what working with him as in an evolutionary perspective of personal gnosis would mean, because that's where my thought process takes me. We can look at the importance of it to the ancient Greeks, but then we're living in the now, and where has the evolution of that energy taken us to when we work and connect with gods such as Dionysus? And these are some of my thoughts, and then we'll talk about like modern themes. So I wrote down here, it was far more of an untamed wildness, a wilderness energy, and that's connecting with that woodland energy. He obviously has a male sexuality. Intoxication, shamanism, magic, joy, hallucination, madness, sexual healing. For me, Dionysus is far more about the intoxication of the senses, pushing the boundaries of knowledge, vision, magic, and accepted norms. The wild shaman is very, very sexual in nature. He's also a hunter, and he is at the fringes, the edges of society, whether that be like in the actual physical woods, which were often considered fringe places, which were also considered places of in-between energies between this realm and the next, or whether it was more to do with the fact that it was this travelling cult that was not in, you know, structured buildings. It was much more of an in-between liminal energy. There was always a movement to it, as well as questioning the idea of wine being on one hand a libation, a divine offering, versus like this drunkard behavior. It's all about the intention that goes into something. And then you have like the sexual energy that comes through with him, and is it sacred union and pleasure versus a liberation of sexual freedoms versus debauchery. And that to me is a really interesting duality here with him, because on the one hand he is all about, you know, the joys, and on the other hand he has this madness and this wrathfulness, and that is supposed to represent the two overarching ways people can go when they're drunk with regards to wine. So wine can be, on the one hand, a sacred offering. It can be used as a intoxicant, but not to the point where one is out of oneself, or where one is not, that's the wrong way of phrasing it, because out of oneself could be used in kind of like astral projection. However, it's still within the control of the senses, I guess. Whereas like the drunkenness is when you have drank so much that you become out of control, and it's kind of like a spinning and a lack of reason goes completely. It was a merriment versus like lack of control. And then there is the wrathful side of getting drunk, the anger, the swelling up of the emotions that have come to the surface, and like the imbibing of alcohol has kind of opened the door to allowing these inner feelings and thoughts and emotions really out of the self. And for me, this is a really fascinating question within modern society, is kind of like the over sanitization of just about everything, and kind of like the repression of a lot of things. We're living in a world which unfortunately is bordering more and more and more on repression. We've had kind of like an age of where liberation has come forward and come forward and come forward, and now unfortunately there is hostility in reaction to liberation, sexual liberation in particular, and there's kind of like now this backlash of the repression, the repressive states, the controlling government bodies that want to I don't know, become more conservative, like take away people's liberations, their sexual freedoms, their even their, you know, their freedoms within gender and things of that nature. And it becomes really quite unsettling that we are living in a time where sexual freedom and liberation is becoming more and more Victorian in a sense, that, you know, this kind of high-handed morality rather than a celebration of sexuality is becoming like enforced. And it really is a unsettling and kind of like chain-like feel. It's kind of like suffocating. And working with Dionysus was really interesting because, you know, you're expecting kind of like, oh well, this play and this joy and, you know, indulge a little, and you're expecting basically a bit of a perverted energy. You're expecting naughtiness, and that's there. That is absolutely there. There's kind of like this naughty, perverted, giggling element of being drunk almost. But he's wilder than that. He's like more ancient and primal and shamanistic than that. And the whole point of like shamanism is traveling, astral traveling, and experiencing the world, usually by some form of intoxication and mind altering substance, or a mixture of substance, and then changing one's consciousness through lots of different means, whether it be intoxicating substance, drumming, meditation, a combination of all of these things. And it's about traveling outside of the self for the most part, seeing the energetic patterns, seeing the things through different eyes, seeing a different way of being and existing. And Dionysus definitely has that wild shaman hunter energy. He also has kind of like that wild hunt energy, which is very much like Koronanos, pronunciation, yay. And it's that kind of going through the woods, that kind of almost predator feel when you're being a hunter, And that goes hand in hand with the sexuality because of the sexual chase thing that happens. And the sexual chase is something which is very well documented throughout history and throughout different cultures of kind of like the pursuit of a sexual partner, and in the animal kingdom versus the human kingdom, and the differences are not perhaps as stark as we might pretend they are. And it's interesting to get back in touch with that animalistic energy within oneself without shame, because Dionysus really kind of like pushes these boundaries, and it's like we have said that such a sexual behavior isn't normal anymore, and like the union between willing adult participants, it gets shamed in modern culture in a lot of ways. There's a lot of sex shaming and rules applied to what is acceptable and what is not within sexual liberation and experience. And Dionysus kind of throws that all out the window, like no, and he refuses to be tied up, unless it's tied up, you know. But he refuses to be tied up by restrictions from like sanitized culture, like the sanitization of sexual liberation and things. Dionysus is not interested in that. In fact, he finds that counter to sexual healing, and sexual healing is something that comes through with him as well. It's kind of like the acceptance of sexual liberation, of what is normal to the individual, rather than what is they're being told. And I will, of course, make a side note that this is not abuse. It's not abusing people. It's not sexual abusing of other people. This is like the joyous, ecstatic sexual joining of people who are willing and able to be willing and enjoy each other. On the other side of things, hallucination and madness is a really interesting concept within the Dionysus energy, particularly within modern times, with mental illness, again, still being one of these things which is judged in society. And Dionysus really does like to go into these areas where there's all this social judgment, and he likes to poke at these areas. He's very baiting in a way. He likes to bait people into debate and argument and discussion, which I guess works within wine, because when the wine flows and all your opinions come flowing out, that you're not holding back out of a sense of shame or fear or any of the rest of it. And the idea of this hallucination and madness goes back to the shaman element within him, and that kind of imbibing, that kind of moving outside of the self, and like if one goes too far, if one does not limit oneself within healthy boundaries, then one can veer over. And it's interesting because there is a line with madness, and it's not like a straight line, but it kind of flows and ebbs a bit, because for magic to really take place, there has to be a loss of some of the control. And I've often said that, you know, a little bit of madness is necessary for magic, because you have to believe to the point of madness that your magic is going to work. You have to just know it is accomplished to the point of almost madness, because other people cannot see or tangibly touch or taste what you believe to be true, and kind of the universe fills that vacuum, fills that void, and things are created. That's the idea, one of the ideas anyway, behind magic and the way that spells work. And obviously believing something within yourself to the point of madness until it becomes that, because you already believe it, so you make it so. Now, to some, the idea of paganism and magic and things, they consider that mad anyway. But to really believe in the spell work to the point of madness, you can see where the kind of frayed line is. And that, again, is kind of like loss of the total control of oneself. And I think Dionysus is very much about challenging where the boundary of control within oneself actually is, because perhaps we're all a bit too Victorian laced up tight when we shouldn't be, and when, to be honest, being that fucking repressed is going to lead to backlash, because it's not balanced whatsoever. And very much like the Victorians had all their very interesting sex clubs in the dark, and rampant prostitution because of the very tight moral guidelines within the home and society, then they had kind of like a seedy underbelly, because they didn't allow for any kind of sexual freedom openly. And Dionysus kind of pokes all of those holes. He's like, it kind of has that energy of, well, if you're going to completely control and constrict something, then it's going to come out in other ways. It's just human nature to engage in sexual behavior in a wildness, in a wilderness, getting back to the wild animalistic self and joy within those things. But then if you push too far, you get too far into like the madness element, and it becomes difficult. He does, of course, talk about like sacred union and the sacred function of pleasure, and I think this is something which is a problem, particularly even now within society, but especially with this repressive thing coming back in, that like women are considered, you know, and even guys to an extent, you know, there is a shaming culture on like sexual enjoyment. It's kind of dirty and seedy and pushed under the carpet. You can see this in all sorts of ways. I mean, yeah, I could talk about like how in terms of pornography, like the female ejaculation in the UK had been like banned, and that's like the epitome of pornography showing a female pleasure, whereas all the rest of it's fine, but within the legal boundaries anyway. But it's all very bizarre. The ideas that come about and show that, you know, sexual liberation is still being fought for on all fronts, and we're having to fight for it even harder even now that there's all this conservative repression coming in. Finally, there's kind of like this looking into the void thing with Dionysus, this being on the fringes, on the edges, on the tips. Like you can go either way. You could fall into madness if you're not careful, or you could walk that boundary, that liminal space between madness and sanity, and be a little crazy, be a little outside the lines. He's a little bit like a guy who's like colouring outside the lines a bit, because he prefers, okay, I'm getting this strong thing about like that's where it's interesting. Like that's where creation happens. That's where conversation truly happens. That's where opinions come out. That's where we discuss and debate. That's where sexuality truly is, like bouncing between that line and really engaging with all elements of the self, with the higher self and the animalistic self, if you like. The combination of all these things lead to human experience. So those are some of the energies and feelings and thoughts that I had about Dionysus within a modern setting, and I'm going to show you now the 3 spell items for Dionysus. So first and foremost, we had a votive. I hope the lighting's going to be okay. It's very, very grey and abysmal, really. So this is the Dionysus spell votive, and I went out of my way to find a particular scent which has a little bit of a alcoholic base, but I didn't want the whole thing to be overarchingly alcoholic on the surface of it, because you look at a lot of spell items for Dionysus and they're like, it's purple like wine, or red like, you know, that red purple like wine, and whereas this could be a white wine, I guess, like with the greens, it's very much more to do with the liminal spaces, that wild shamanism, that it's intoxicating, but it's also shamanistic, wild woods, the hunter, and all that good stuff, with just plenty of shimmy. Then we have the spell oil. Again, I wanted it to be somewhere between. I didn't want it to be, you know, your stereotypical berries or things that are going in wine necessarily. There is an element of like the vines and things in here. There is a kind of like that binding energy, and I don't mean like binding in terms of binding magic. I mean that kind of binding and wrapping and encirculating Encirculating, that's not a word. I was somewhere between encircling and insulating. That's not a word. Are you drunk, Joe? Are you drunk on Dionysus? You might be. Anyway, so there's kind of like that twisting vine energy that he has to him, and that can be like almost the senses, almost like that like a little bit of madness, that little bit of tweak bit of the self, a little bit of the twist of the DNA, a little bit of the mystery and the magic and the in-between spaces, and keeping oneself grounded within that energy, and wandering through a little bit like his wandering cults as well. So I hope. If not, there are pictures on Instagram which are far better, and until I get a better camera, which I truly hope won't take too long, because this working on the iPad is driving me to the point of craziness, I swear. This is my favourite. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Right, this is a smudge. It's wild, it's intoxicating, it's that wild shamanistic element. It does have an energy which is all about not tricking the senses, but raising energetic vibration. It's all about pushing boundaries of understanding and perception, and intoxicating the senses. A little bit hallucination, but not too much. Like there's no poisons in here or anything, because I'm not risking my ass by selling poisons. And it's very much about knowledge, visions, magic, pushing the boundaries to get the visions, to get the magic flowing, to get the connection to the other side, about working in those liminal spaces. It's also about celebrating the sexual nature, the sexual temple, all that sacred union energies. Is wonderful, and I really, really love it. I love this. Creating that temple of Dionysus, it has to be in the woods, it has to be a free energy, it has to be like a sexual liberation, it has to be surrounded by trees and vines and sense of it's like a orgasmic ecstasy party in the woods, without shame, really. It's just, oh, I love this smell. I'm really, really tempted to make one and use one for myself, and I'd be really interested to see what the results were, because I don't tend to work with Greek gods for long periods of time, other than Hades, who keeps poking me every now and again. Right, so that is the video talking about Dionysus. Those are his spell items. I will definitely make the smudge available again. If anyone else wants the other two, they can order those per request. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any further questions about Dionysus, please pop them down below, and many blessings.